So there's different funding sources available, and the different ownership approaches will, have some that are more relevant than others. But the key point here is that you should always be asking how to stack the funds from these various sources in order to meet your project needs. So first, an example of how local funding might be used. There might be annual or ongoing revenue sources like from, a budgeting process or tax revenues. Others can be influxes through a bond or a legal or utility settlement. In this slide, we've highlighted an example from Burlington, Vermont, where voters recently approved a $20 million bond over 3 years that will be used for things like grid upgrades and EV charging infrastructure. So depending on where you are or your community, you might have different options available, but encourage you to reflect on what local funding sources you have used within your cities and departments, and what challenges or successes came along with that. Don't have time for a share out at this moment, but would encourage you to bring that up in the breakout sessions later. So another source of funding is utility spending. And this is usually regulated through PUC dockets, in which, one of the sort of prime examples is utility make-ready programs, which cover the utility side of the meter costs like trenching, wiring, and other construction and site preparation costs. One wrinkle here is that what exactly is covered in these programs, depends. It can depend on sort of, how far is considered, utility coverage for, which assets. And it may also vary based on customer type. So really encourage you to look into detail at sort of what is covered under your local utility make-ready programs. Also just wanted to point out that these make-ready programs generally only cover a portion of the total project cost. So one estimate out of California found that utility make-ready programs will generally cover somewhere in the ballpark of like 30% of project costs, with the other 70% of the cost coming on the customer side of the meter. So things like, upgrades to the circuit panel or the charger itself. So there's also, of course, a variety of funding available at the federal level for local governments. Before we jump into these in greater detail, just wanted to point out that there's a lot of variety in what those supports might look like. So in direct funding support, there's discretionary and formula grants, but there's also other forms of direct funding that the federal government offers. There's also technical assistance and financing and loans options, as well as tax credits that might be available. So big story of the past year, of course, year and a half, is Bill and IRA. The bolded programs on these slides are ones that Bill and IRA either added or heavily modified. So as you can see, these come in a lot of different forms. There are brand new funding programs. There are new eligible uses in existing programs. And there's also new monetization options like direct pay eligibility for tax credits. So I've indicated here, the key agencies associated with each program, but also did want to call out that there's been a joint office that was created between the U.S. Department of Energy and Transportation to coordinate and provide assistance on many of these programs. So in the following slides, I'm going to focus on some of these programs in particular. So first, formula funding programs. This slide covers 2 new programs and 1 amendment to an existing program. So major story that you might have heard about is NEVI. This, of course, is a $5 billion program that focuses on corridor charging. The funding for NEVI flows through state DOTs, and local governments are not eligible as direct recipients, but of course may certainly be impacted. So states were required to develop state plans in order to access the NEVI funding. These were approved last year, and states can now be reimbursed for projects. So we encourage local governments to get in touch with your relevant state contacts as they begin to move forward with these projects. On the surface transportation block grants, this is an existing program you're probably familiar with, but did want to call out that final point that the eligible use of funds now includes the installation of EV charging infrastructure. And for the carbon reduction program, this is a new program to reduce transportation emissions. There's a planning component that will be wrapped up in the fall of this year. And did also want to point out that 2/3 of the funds here are obligated based on population size. So those are a couple of the new formula funding, programs or amended ones that will have funds coming to your state. Also wanted to call out some of just the competitive discretionary grant programs that require, applications. First, wanted to highlight the Federal Highway Administration discretionary grant program for charging and fueling infrastructure. So this is 2.5 billion out of NEVI that is specifically targeted for local government and state entities to invest in corridor and community charging that is missed by NEVI. So half of these funds are set aside for investments in rural, low and moderate income, and low parking areas. And we'll have more information on that one on the next slide. There's also RAISE, formerly known as the Build and Tiger grants, and neighborhood access and equity grants. I'm highlighting these here because both have EV charging eligibility, even if it might not be the primary purpose of the program or the example that first comes to mind. So encourage you to think about how EV charging might fit in with your community's other transportation and equity goals as you consider these programs and others. So, as mentioned, wanted to call out a recent announcement from the Federal Highway Administration on February 15th. This announcement covers the final ruling on minimum standards for chargers built out using federal funding. It also announced the first round of funding from the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. We expect $700 million to be available in that first round of funding. The notice of funding opportunity will be posted at the site listed below. We encourage you all to monitor that and see if it might fit into your community needs. Second recent opportunity to highlight is this new opportunity that just had a notice of intent published. This is for the Ride and Drive Electric program. And in particular, wanted to call out this program that is on the community-driven models for electric vehicle charging deployment in the notice of intent. So this has a focus on looking at community-driven models and looking at community benefits and ways to incorporate novel financing to increase accessibility of these chargers to different communities. A notable thing here is that the projects should include or be led by community serving organizations. So just really see this as a good chance to center equity and community-driven procedural equity in your process. Again, we expect to see the FOA for that one announced sometime in March.